Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So most parents will have heard of timeout, but this is actually an abbreviation. The proper term is timeout from positive reinforcement. It's argued that the abbreviated term is problematic because it may lead to a misunderstanding, whereby timeout is seen as a standalone strategy rather than a strategy that's part of a broader parenting approach involving positive interactions with a child. So in this video, I'm going to provide a brief history of timeout from positive reinforcement, before then considering the evidence that's tested its effectiveness in reducing behavioural problems in kids. If you're interested in how timeout tends to be implemented in parenting interventions, you can check out my video in the link below. So, the invention of timeout from positive reinforcement in the context of parenting has been attributed to Wolf. However, you can find earlier references to the strategy in studies by behavioural psychologists who are running experiments with pigeons. Now, this isn't surprising, as the principles developed by behavioural psychologists form the basis of timeout from positive reinforcement. Specifically, the idea put forward by behavioural psychologists was that behaviours followed by a reinforcer, you could probably think of it as a reward, are more likely to happen again, whereas behaviours followed by punishment are less likely to happen again. So in the context of parenting, reinforcers such as praise, attention, hugs, or spending quality time with your child should lead to an increase in a specified behaviour. On the other hand, punishments such as taking away a toy, loss of TV or other privileges, ignoring the child, or time out should lead to a decrease in a specified behaviour. From the beginning, the effectiveness of timeout from positive reinforcement was thought to be critically dependent on there being such reinforcement in the home environment. That is, if the parent is not providing the kid with positive reinforcement, then there's nothing to take timeout from. Therefore, many parenting programs were structured so that parents first practice using positive reinforcement with their children before later introducing timeout. For example, an early parenting program developed by Hanth involved 2 stages. In stage 1, parents were taught to use positive reinforcement, for example, attending to the child, showing interest in the child's activities, praise, physical affection, and so on. And this was done to build a positive relationship between the parent and child. Timeout was then introduced in stage 2, along with other strategies. So timeout from positive reinforcement remains a key strategy used in contemporary evidence-based parenting programs, such as parent-child interaction therapy, parent management training, Triple P, and others. It's also a popular strategy used by parents more generally. For example, in a study of around 400 parents, Riley found that about 75% reported using timeout from positive reinforcement, though 85% used it in a way that was not consistent with the proper way. So in the rest of this video, I'll look at evidence for the claim that timeout from positive reinforcement is effective in reducing problematic behaviours in kids. In another video, I discuss research investigating the best way to put timeout from positive reinforcement into practice, and also have a video in which I discuss research concerning whether timeout from positive reinforcement causes harm to kids. So, is timeout from positive reinforcement effective in reducing problematic behaviours in kids? And the answer is yes. On balance, the available evidence suggests that timeout is effective in reducing problematic behaviours. But there are some caveats which I'll discuss. So there are 2 main sources of evidence for this claim. The first comes from research that has looked at whether the inclusion versus exclusion of timeout in parenting programs increases the therapeutic benefits of those programs. The second comes from randomized control trials, or RCTs, that have directly investigated the impact of timeout from positive reinforcement on problematic behaviours in kids. I'll discuss each in turn below, starting with the inclusion of timeout in parenting interventions. So as mentioned, many parenting interventions include timeout as a strategy for improving kids' behaviours, but not all of them. So Kaminsky looked at studies investigating the impact of different types of parenting interventions on externalizing behaviours. And these behaviours include, among other things, non-compliance, that is the kid not doing what they've been asked, aggressiveness, and tantrums. The researchers compared the effectiveness of these interventions when timeout from positive reinforcement was, versus when it was not, part of the interventions. What they found was that interventions including timeout were a bit more effective in reducing externalizing behaviours than programs that left this component out. For stats people, the effect size was about 0.15 bigger, that is about 0.5 compared to 0.35. And this suggests that timeout from positive reinforcement may be an important ingredient in the reduction of problematic behaviours in kids. However, a major problem with this approach for determining whether timeout is effective is that the interventions that include a timeout may have systematically differed in other ways from the interventions that did not include timeout. Therefore, these differences could explain the results reported by Kaminsky rather than the inclusion of timeout. But as mentioned, we also have evidence from RCTs that have looked at the effectiveness of timeout from positive reinforcement in reducing problematic behaviours in kids, which I'll now discuss. So Lazare conducted a meta-analysis on RCTs that have investigated the impact of timeout in reducing problematic behaviours in kids. And it's the only such meta-analysis that I'm aware of. Now, if you haven't heard of meta-analysis before, it's basically an approach that involves synthesizing data across a bunch of studies to try and get a better estimate of an effect. So Lazare included 6 RCTs investigating the impact of timeout on problematic behaviours in kids. And here's a brief summary of these studies. So the kids in these studies were participating mostly because they were not complying with their parents' requests, though in a couple of studies the kids were also having issues with fighting or externalizing problems more generally. Across the studies, the age range of kids was 2 to 10 years old, and most involved recruiting both boys and girls. The sample sizes of the studies were small, ranging from 18 to 43 participants, with an average sample size of about 30. All studies involved a timeout condition, though most had 2 timeout conditions, varying in the specific timeout protocol used. And these were compared either to a condition involving use of some other parenting strategy, for example, helping the kid to problem solve, or to a control condition, for example, no treatment. So here are the results of the meta-analysis. In terms of compliance, the most commonly assessed outcome, kids who were given timeout complied with their parents' requests about 30% of the time prior to being given timeout, but about 80% of the time when timeout was delivered. In contrast, the compliance rates of kids who were not given timeout got a bit worse, starting at about 35% and falling to about 25% at the end of studies. For stats people, the effect size was a D of 1.8, which is quite big. For the other 2 outcomes, fighting and externalizing behaviors, the results also suggested timeout was effective, again with effect sizes greater than 1. So while this looks good, there are a few limitations of these studies. The most obvious is the small sample sizes. The problem is made worse by the fact that the studies each involved allocating participants to 1 of 3 or more conditions. With an average sample size of about 30 per study, this would mean that there would be around 10 kids in each condition. These days, it would be very tough to publish an RCT with these kinds of participant numbers. You might be able to get away with calling it a pilot study. A second issue is that some of the studies were conducted in the lab, involving only 1 or 2 sessions in which timeout was delivered and its impact assessed. Now, the advantage of this approach is that the researchers can be confident in their assessment of child behaviours, as these can be measured under the same controlled conditions. But there are disadvantages. A big one being that you can't be confident the results would generalise to the real world, that is, when parent and child are back at home. And lastly, there was little to no follow-up of kids, and there are 2 problems with this. First, you don't know how long any benefits of timeout would last. For example, maybe you get an immediate benefit, but this wanes over time. Second, it may be that some of the other parenting strategies, such as problem solving, are as effective as timeout, but their benefit takes longer to emerge, and so was missed in these studies. So the meta-analytic evidence from these RCTs clearly supports the claim that timeout from positive reinforcement can reduce problematic behaviours in kids. However, I reckon this claim should be tempered in that we're lacking the kinds of studies that could provide stronger confidence in the efficacy of timeout. That is, RCTs that involve large sample sizes, require timeout to be used in the home, involve the assessment of the impact of timeout in the home, and involve long-term follow-up. So in summary, is timeout from positive reinforcement effective in reducing problematic behaviours in kids? Notwithstanding the problems associated with the research, the evidence only supports one answer: yes. So that's it for the evidence supporting the effectiveness of timeout from positive reinforcement. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.